Welcome to our lecture on modern pain theory. So at this point, we've talked about past pain theory and kind of where it's led to today. Well, let's talk about where pain theory is at today. And even some of this lecture, we're going to see how some of this was created in the late 80s, but still struggling to be incorporated into current medical practice, current physical therapy practice, and just healthcare in general. So there's some frustrating parts of this lecture as well, but we'll touch upon some of the advances we've seen in theory with some of the new technology, fMRI scans and different things like that, that have helped us better understand the pain experience. So how we're really taught and how pain really works. So we're all, I shouldn't say we're all, because that's maybe making a reach, but a lot of us are taught that there are pain receptors out there, that pain travels along a pain pathway that reaches pain centers, and then thus there's a pain experience. We have to recognize that that's really wrong. There's not pain receptors. There's nociceptors and other sensory gathering apparatuses within our nervous system that are really going to be monitoring the internal and external state. So internally, what's going on within our body, within our tissues, but also our senses, what's going on in our environment, exteroceptive information of sight, sound, smell, all these different things, but also what are our beliefs, thoughts, and past experiences around this. A lot more complex than what we've considered. Pain pathways, there's nociceptive pathways, but there's also so many other pathways besides nociceptive pathways that are involved in pain experiences. Also biochemical pathways of how the nervous system and immune system communicate and influence one another, and how our endocrine system is kind of interweaved within the nervous system and immune system's homeostatic functions within our bodies. And there aren't pain centers in the brain. There are centers in the brain that are commonly active in a pain experience when the organism is trying to determine the saliency of stimuli or if something's threatening or not, but we don't have specific areas in the brain that are pain centers. There's just centers of the brain such as memory, past experience, or movement areas, sensory information, a lot of different parts of the brain that are active in a pain experience. And we do have pain experiences, but this is not linear. There is so many dimensions that make it hard to conceptualize. It makes it much more complex. We learn things very categorically and specific, but man, it just isn't that way. And it incorporates a lot of different bodies of knowledge to really understand pain and the experience of pain that people in our care are going through. One of the more current popular models is the Neuromatrix model by Ronald Melzack, and it really moved us forward as far as maybe understanding what's going on that complements what was limitations of his gate control theory that he developed with Patrick Wall. But it looked at this really inputs into this neurobody matrix that were coming from cognitive related areas where we're starting to think about memories of past experience. We're looking at the attention. What does this mean to me? Is this safe or is this dangerous? Anxiety levels, baseline stress levels. As physical therapists, we primarily parked ourselves at the middle one there of sensory signaling systems. So we were trying to influence sensory input into cutaneous, visceral, musculoskeletal inputs, which again isn't wrong, but really misses the whole piece of the inputs that the organism's gathering to decide on a pain experience. Emotion-related brain areas. So we're looking at limbic system, your centers of emotion, your anger, your fear, your anxiety. What's the level of our immune system reactivity and endocrine system arousal levels, or nervous system sensitization levels that go into that experience that patient has, that are going to greatly cause so much differences in, our fibromyalgia patients, for instance, are often highly in a pro-inflammatory state. There's been studies to show that they have high levels of inflammatory markers, cytokines going on when they encounter some different movements or strains. Maybe it explains why their system sometimes really has a sensitive reaction to it, because they have a lot of baseline emotion-related brain areas and homeostatic areas that are very sensitive to begin with, that cause their experience of pain to be different than somebody else's who might experience the very same pain stimulus or noxious input into their body. Then we have to understand the outputs. So there's pain perception, which is where we are in physical therapy and in healthcare. What's your pain? What's your pain? 0 to 10. What's your pain? 0 to 10. What's your pain? Ridiculous reductionist efforts at conceptualizing an immensely an immensely complex experience. And it's mainly based on insurance companies and that whole pain being the fifth vital sign and all this ridiculous things of how we've looked at pain in the past that still hang with us today. We'll talk about that 0 to 10 pain scale and how it's a ridiculous pursuit, and oftentimes I'd say harmful iatrogenic pursuit when we're constantly having patients, what's your pain, what's your pain, what's your pain. But again, we're looking at sensory affective and cognitive dimensions. What's their thoughts around this pain experience? How are they emotionally reacting to this pain experience? Action programs is where we kind of often will also look in physical therapy. We'll look at how are they moving after a technique. So we're looking at voluntary movement patterns, sometimes involuntary movement patterns with patients who have these pain behaviors. And our understanding of how we move with pain and how that's our motor control is influenced by pain through the works of folks like Paul Hodges and Lorimer Moseley and a lot of different people has really made us think that maybe it's a defense mechanism of how we move versus some specific peripherally driven movement change or a muscle imbalance, that maybe these imbalances are all just the organism's way of producing the best protective output that it can based on its best understanding and conception of the experience that it's going through. But then we also have to recognize that there's patients who have stress regulation program responses to this. So whiplash patients, for example, who go through a very traumatic experience, often leading them to our clinic where they've been in a serious car accident. And we may have seen these patients. I know I, in my practice, frequently will see whiplash patients who have significant anxiety of getting behind the wheel, that their stress systems are highly upregulated. And I had a patient recently who started just talking about their pain and starts crying and couldn't understand why she was crying because there wasn't anything going on. But it just, to me, was a good representation of how this stress and emotional regulation systems can become dysregulated and dysfunctional after pain experiences, injuries, and sometimes chronically, even when injuries have healed. And a lot of the things that surround some of these stressful experiences and some of the chronic stressors that we as human beings uniquely carry around with us chronically may explain why these systems stay dysregulated even after tissues heal, but we'll go further into that in further discussions. The other thing that I like to do with this model is just really take a peek at where is healthcare hanging out with this. And as I alluded to earlier, to really understand a complex experience, we sometimes have to break it down into pieces and understand the pieces before we can kind of put together the pieces and the parts. The problem with healthcare is we're still all a bunch of pieces. We're not really seeing that this experience doesn't just lie in a psychologist's hands. It doesn't just lie in a physical therapist's hands. It doesn't just lie in a neurologist's hands. It doesn't just lie in an endocrinologist's hands. They all have unique perspectives, and probably important perspectives to understand, to really get the best understanding of the complexity of what is a pain experience. But the problem in healthcare, and I've worked in health systems where these patients with complex pain states go through literally 50, 60 to over 100 visits with various specialists who all have their little unique way of looking at the pain experience, but nobody's connecting the dots for these people. Nobody is giving them a visualization of how this all correlates and how what can be dysregulation of endocrine markers in your body can also create significant sensitivity in your musculoskeletal structures, and how we can't take your thoughts in psychology and put them in a little bucket that cordons them off, that your thoughts can influence your biology. And it's a mess, but it's a system that is so inefficient that doesn't really give folks a good understanding of their pain, and oftentimes spins people into the medical merry-go-round where nobody's connecting the dots for these people. And I always tell my students, really, if you want to become the best pain therapist or best understander of pain out there, you need to become a psycho, neuroimmunomusculoskeletal, genital, endocrine, behavioral, cognitivologist, and we could probably throw other professions in there. But we definitely need to look outside of just our little narrow musculoskeletal profession if we're going to understand pain and best help the patients who are coming to see us for us to help them with their pain. So it would probably make sense to best understand pain if that's what the patients are wanting us to help them with. I could go on to that soapbox forever. One of the more brilliant models out there that still really has been shown to be useful today, and Mick Thacker has kind of updated it. He's a good friend of Lewis Gifford, who unfortunately no longer is with us anymore, but a brilliant pioneer in our understanding of pain, who really looked at this model that he created called the mature organism model. And it really just looked at an organism when they're going through a pain experience is going to sample first their environment and their internal state. So their external state and their internal state, both exteroceptive information and interoceptive information from their tissues, and gather that information. But it's also going to gather information from the brain. What's been my past experience What do I think about this? What are my memories about this? All the things that, and what has my mom and dad taught me about this? What have I seen others do when they've been encountering this situation? There's a lot of other things that we could talk about that the brain's taking into account for information. Am I fearful of this situation? Has this been an area where I've almost lost my life or had a severe injury? So there's a sampling function of our neuroimmune endocrine system that then becomes a decision-making process from our central nervous system of, based on all this information that we just talked about, what the heck do I need to do? What is my best response based on this information and based on my past experience and based on a lot of the different things we spoke about and the factors leading up into it. And then what happens is a response. So that response can be neurologically, immunologically, and endocrinology, but basically it's also motor systems. How do we need to move? You know, we all splint an acute injury, or most of us, I should say, to protect it. You know, sometimes after that whiplash, when somebody's moving their neck like this, probably a pretty helpful response because they got a bunch of tissues that went through an immense amount of strain, and we've seen studies with post-whiplash injuries where there are significant soft tissue disruption with it, that it makes sense that your nervous system should tense and brace and not let the neck move for a short period of time. Maybe we don't need to get in there and start monkeying around and trying to mess with the protective reaction that's going on. That's a very helpful adaptive one at that time. Now, I'll talk to that patient, 3 to 6 months or thereon after that, and that response is still going on. Then that becomes maladaptive, and that's something we probably need to address and talk to the patient about and help them work their way out of it. But a lot of the things that surround whiplash injuries would make sense why a patient doesn't feel they're safe to not perform those protective behaviors. So there's a boatload of different things that go on with behavior and motor system behavior and sympathetic autonomic behavior after these injuries, these responses that we need to pay attention to. But these autonomic dysregulations that happen after injuries, sweaty, different things, heart rates racing, blood pressures increasing, all these things that happen when the autonomic system's in a danger threat mode that we need to take into account. But it also makes sense with some of these patients who have these weird sweaty symptoms, these weird heart racy, shallow breathing, and it makes sense why maybe we should teach people to tap into autonomic regulation through breathing, through mindful movement, through relaxation, through things that can help bring their system down into a more safe or safety in me or SIM state, as David Butler and Lorimer Moseley would talk about. So it's a complex reaction, it's a complex system, it's a complex thing that's going on 24/7, 365 with our body. This is going on throughout all our tissues at all times. Our nervous system's taking information, scrutinizing and deciding what to do, and hopefully it's making some decisions that allow you to be a healthy organism. But it doesn't always work that way, as we'll talk about when we get into some of the vulnerable organism model and other thoughts that go around what happens when the system's responding chronically in a danger mode. We also have to recognize that nociceptive input has been a very important thing and continues to be an important thing that we need to be good physical therapists or good healthcare professionals to evaluate for. We can't just assume that somebody has a persistent pain state, that there may not be some nociceptive contributors to that pain experience. Now, I think traditionally we've way thought too highly of nociception as the prime and sole generator of a pain experience, so we have to put it in perspective. But it's important not to take the flip approach and then disregard nociception completely and forget that tissues get injured and can need to be addressed specifically from a tissue-based level. But also that input from our tissues needs to travel through a central nervous system that's influenced by beliefs, that's influenced by knowledge, and we all know where knowledge can go awry when you Dr. Google and learn about your condition and hear all kinds of maladaptive beliefs and stories around different conditions that patients will look on the internet for. There's expectations. So maybe patients come in with positive expectations because you really fixed their spouse when they had a similar condition, so there's positive expectations. Or maybe they've had an encounter with the orthopedist who's told them, oh, you have bone on bone and it's just a matter of time before you need your joint replacement. So again, we steal the self-efficacy from patients and pretty much make them fail physical therapy before they start. That's another soapbox that we'll get on in future lectures. But their social context, what's going on in their workplace, around their family, and where they function and live socially. Sometimes the family responses and workplace responses aren't that adaptive. They aren't that helpful. They oftentimes can drive maladaptive behaviors and beliefs. So we need to understand what's going on in those. But then any other sensory cue, the sensory cues that encounter or accompany a whiplash injury, this being behind the wheel of a car, the being at the intersection where you we're in the severe accident, all these different things that can trigger a significant different reaction, or those sensory cues can put you in a situation where your nervous system, your protection homeostatic systems ascribe danger to those sensory cues, and therefore mounts a more protective response when those sensory cues are present. And this is a graphic that probably still doesn't do justice to a pain experience, but it really looks at it as far as, this consciousness generation of all these inputs, and we could probably go into more of them, like I said, but the cultural context. It's important to understand the culture that the patient brings to your treatment that is going to usually form how they think and behave around their symptoms based on how their culture teaches them to. Also past learning they may have had. They may have, ideally when you're a kiddo and you put your hand on a hot burner, you learn that that's probably not a good idea going forward. We've spoke about the social and the environmental factors with family and work. Baseline stress system activity. This is where we talk about the fibromyalgia patient with baseline kind of immune system sensitivity and neuroimmune endocrine system sensitivity. Emotions, are they depressed, are they angry, are they sad, are they frustrated, whatever it may be that goes on with that patient. Nociceptive input, again, still a very important part of that experience. Exteroceptive, interoceptive information of what your body's gathering from within the body and external to the body, and all these things coming together to generate the conscious experience of pain. And this is an emergent process that comes out of your brain into a conscious experience where you develop a pain experience from a much more complex perspective than what we think about when we think about that linear biomedical model. And really, again, it's ridiculous to think that a 0 to 10 scale is going to capture the complexity of what we just talked about there. Yet we do it every day with patients, so it's not very helpful. Now, one of the more challenging problems that faces us from a philosophical perspective, from a physics, a lot of different things, neuroscience perspective, is consciousness. We don't know how your system generates the conscious kind of running experience of consciousness that we have every moment that we're awake and conscious in our lives. So until we can really crack that problem, and we got some pretty brilliant thinkers and philosophers and Nobel-winning people going after this problem and struggling to solve it. So it's not like it's just a simple thing, but until we really understand that, it may be difficult for us to understand the complexity of the pain experience. And I wanted to leave you with one quote that I think truly encapsulates where we are in healthcare and where we should be going in healthcare in the future if we're going to better treat and help people. So it's by Gordon Waddell, who again unfortunately passed away recently in the last few years, but a brilliant person whose work got terribly misinterpreted, and he spent a significant amount of time trying to really help people better understand that his tests were not, the Waddell signs were not meant to find malingering. They're not to see who's faking and who has real pain. Unfortunately, that's still how they're used in a lot of settings. It's to see who is going to respond to surgical intervention and who may not. And if you think about those tests and look at them, they're more a test of a sensual sensitivity, or maybe symptoms that are non-mechanical in nature that may lead us to think, man, this isn't tissue driven. Maybe there's a lot more things to this pain experience than the back facets or discs that we're going to traditionally look at with it. But he speaks of, it's no longer enough to know about anatomy and pathology. The biocycle approach opens a whole new perspective on how people behave and cope with illness. It reveals the limitations of our treatment and of our professional skills. It exposes us to the difficulties and stresses of dealing with emotions. We must accept that patients are not neat packages of mechanics or pathology, but suffering human beings. Professional life may be much simpler if we stick to physical treatment of mechanical problems, but healthcare demands that we treat human beings. One of my biggest crusades is to bring the humanities back to healthcare, because they've gotten removed from healthcare. We don't talk to people, we don't listen to people, we don't listen to their emotions, we don't hear their frustrations, we don't hear how they're struggling and suffering in life. We focus hyper vigilantly on their tissues, their x-rays, their segmental mobility findings, and we forget that there is a suffering human being that's in front of us that we need to really listen to and hear their story if we're going to best help them. So let's look at a case example. One of these case examples that I love is this case example that comes to us from the British Medical Journal. A case example where this 29-year-old person jumps off a platform and lands and sees this nail sticking up through the floorboards into his foot. So pretty scary looking experience where this gentleman's got a nail poking up through. The story goes, or the case study goes, where he comes to the emergency room in severe amounts of pain. He is unconsolable. They need to give him a powerful amount of pain relievers, basically a tranquilizer, and knock him out so they can remove the boot and remove the nail from his foot. Lo and behold, when they put him under anesthetic and knock him out, they take this boot off, and the nail has traveled between his toes. So this man has a excruciatingly painful pain experience, yet there's very minimal tissue damage. So again, if nociception and tissue damage are synonymous, how does that make any sense? Well, it doesn't if you think about pain that way. But holy cow, did his nervous system ascribe a significant amount of threat with the visual input he was getting from a nail poking up through his shoe, and from all the thoughts and beliefs he knows about what that means when a nail pokes through your shoes. Maybe he had a colleague who had that happen to him before and had a horrible experience. Who knows? But again, it just goes to show you that nociception and pain can be on two different levels and are very often, can be correlated, but in this case, extremely non-correlated. And the thing we also have to think about is, could imaging findings be the nail for the patient? So could the visual of the MRI finding of the bulging disc, or could there be some things that maybe we don't know what's going on inside that shoe or inside that back, but our visual of it is a nail or a disc bulging into a nerve root? And you see all these horrible iatrogenic models out there of disc models where the red blob pokes into the nerve. So these people have these horrible visions of nails piercing their back, or bad things going on in their tissues that could create a significant pain experience just based on the danger, fear-inducing iatrogenic consequences of these visuals that we give to patients. So I would argue to say that imaging absolutely can be the nail to some patient, that even though it may not mean much from a nociception standpoint, that their beliefs and their thoughts of danger and negative expectation are stoked by these findings, because we still explain them horribly to patients, and it still drives a boatload of disability with our patients. This is a great story, and it's a book from a patient who went through a pretty nasty experience with back pain. And again, we have to recognize that this is one of the nastier experiences, and there's a lot of people who might be treated very adaptively, although the more we see out there, the less I'm confident that happens as a general rule. But anyway, this patient wrote a book about her travels through the back pain industry, and she talked about, the interviewer interviewed her and asked, "You describe a personal diagnosis called degenerative disc disease. That sounds incredibly frightening." And she responds, "Scary." And when I heard it the first time and the second and the fifth time, I was very, very scared. It sounded bad. It sounded like doomsday. I thought we were going to have to widen the doorways to the bathroom so that I could get in a wheelchair. No one said to me, "That really sounds terrible, but it isn't, so just don't worry about it." Instead, the doctor's receptionist said in a very serious tone, "You really need to come in right away so we can talk about next steps." I thought, oh God, really? I was about 51 or 52, and I thought, this just can't be happening. But what I learned over the years was this diagnosis is nonsense, because everybody has degenerative discs in their spine. I can't tell you how often this type of story hits my caseload on a regular basis, of people who have poorly explained imaging findings, who have imaging findings that are very normal for their age group, but who are given horrible, horrible visions and thoughts around it, because they have medical people who are still looking at it, not purposely or not purposely iatrogenically, in dated ways of looking at it, that they think that if that finding's there on a film, that must explain their pain, when it doesn't. And we do so much harm to people based on